So my name is Kelly, and I really, really warmly welcome you to Vikki Price's presentation, International Connections, Exploring the Breadths of Togetherness. So Vikki says that her experience of peer support and learning about shared experience has been life-changing. It has allayed fears of being inherently broken and has connected her to a community of peers that far expands on her own little corner of the world. From a startling place of complete isolation, Vikki has found her own sense of belonging among her peers that she never imagined possible. And beyond that, whole communities of people with different ideas, interpretations, and beliefs all around the world. And these relationships have helped her feel part of something much bigger, more meaningful, more tangible than she could ever possibly feel on her own. So Vikki is a lived experience strategist, intelligence analyst, and project manager with a varied 20-year career spanning justice, law enforcement, and mental health sectors. A passionate advocate for lived experience, expertise, trauma-informed approaches, human rights, accountability, and integrity across statutory sectors. She brings her own personal experiences of peer support, collective advocacy, psychiatric diagnosis and treatment, and life-interrupting distress to her work. So we warmly welcome you, Vikki, and we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation and adding to our Congress.
Thanks so much. Thank you. And I do feel like I'm just going to caveat this with I'm probably going to cry through most of this, and not so much because of the fact that I'm sad, but just because I feel really connected, and that I've learned over time that connection actually means something if I can feel something with it. And for so long, really feeling like I was being told it was inappropriate to feel about connections, that now I really value that. So I hope people don't mind. And also, well, it's kind of going to happen anyway, whether there's any mind or not. But also, I hope people will feel okay to come on that journey with us. And yeah, so I want to start by just completely being upfront with the fact that although I had an intention for what I wanted to talk about today, I had no idea how I was going to do it until about 11 o'clock this morning. No doubt frustrating all of the Congress organisers who've been really good with letting me know what I needed to do when I've been really bad at letting them know what my intentions were, because I didn't really know. But I'd had the chance obviously to come and see some of the speakers yesterday and again today, and then just something fell into place this morning where I was like, right, okay, this is what I want to share, and really being able to vibe off what's been talked about so far. So that felt like a real gift, to leave it till the last minute and then stress myself out incredibly with it at the last minute. So my intention is, because I feel hugely like my story is so entwined with other people's that I've met along the way, but then also that real kind of respect for confidentiality and for what's happened in those places with other people. You might see a lot of me, this photo is a photo of me when I was a kid, so there's going to be a lot of focus on me in this presentation, but really it's more because of the fact that I just don't, obviously there's limits around what I can share with other people's, but really it is meant to be a conversation about connectedness and about learning and about the journey that I've been on. And then also this weird kind of thing that happened with my technical knowledge, being an intelligence analyst, which is something I'll talk about later, and how sometimes that I find that knowledge or meaning comes from weird places. And then it happened to come a little bit for me from social network analysis, which is entirely about statistics and computers and counting numbers, which generally isn't something that I find a lot of confidence or safety in, but somehow this seemed to fit. So I wanted to talk a bit about that. But I really wanted to start here because this photograph is hugely meaningful to me. So that's me when I was a young bairn up in this village where I still live now. And that gentleman behind me is my granddad. So my granddad was called Norman, which generally around here was seen as being quite a boring name, but he was a far from boring man. And his storytelling and his character, and the fact that he was grumpy whilst also being incredibly generous and kind, and for years and years of my life had me absolutely convinced that he wrote Treasure Island, which, you know, I was very surprised to find it in a bookstore one day. But just this creation of this world that he created for me when I was a child, and how much I took of that with me, and how ironic it was today for me to find that photo and be like, yeah, actually, because my first unusual experience that I remember was him being at the turn of the millennium, where I live in this village. We live on top of a hill. And outside the house I grew up in as a child, there was just fields and valleys. And at the turn of the millennium, midnight, 1999 to 2000, I remember standing on the outside on the edge of this valley with just like fireworks going off, people celebrating the millennium, my family around me. And I remember him being stood beside me. And he'd actually, and this is a beautiful feeling and I'm happy to feel it, but he'd actually passed 2 weeks before. And I have that memory as a real thing. And I remember him being there, absolutely being there. And obviously for many people all around me and for many people in my life, that isn't possible. And that separation of my reality from their reality is such an intrinsic part of my story. And I think that's why I was so moved by what Peter was saying about neglect and how that takes us into different worlds, and how much I was able, like knowing that I was going to start with this particular slide today, how much that touched me to hear that, to have that seen and heard just before I was about to speak. This man who meant so much to me in my life and created so much love and safety for me when I was a child, felt seen and heard as well in that moment that Peter was speaking earlier on. So thank you for that, Peter. I know he's not in the room, and then because dogs are the best thing in the world ever, as far as I'm concerned. My own lurcher will no doubt make an appearance at some point. That's why I'm sat on the sofa, so that she can actually be beside me. Otherwise, she will just pester me throughout the entirety of today. So I wanted to start with a little bit about me, and then also about this thing that happened this morning. So I really feel privileged with the generosity of what's been shared by people so far over the last few days. Really give me confidence to bring myself today, I guess. But then also, like, just so much similarity that I've heard from my journey and with other people's journeys that have spoke about what they've shared over the last couple of days in keynotes and in some of the other concurrent sessions. And for me, like, I decided to draw it this morning, and it really helped me pull this together. It's like this feeling of just being separate. And I've talked about this before as feeling like what was expected of me as a high performing student at school, as someone who came from a family that was really well loved and had a lot of privilege, in a community which was very mixed, and where there was a lot of different, like, not mixed as in culturally, but mixed as in experiences of like poverty and wealth and empowerment or disempowerment, or the haves and have-nots and that kind of thing. Like the person who I was expected to be and what was seen to be acceptable and how I was able to be in the world was not the person that I felt that I was. And that what I learned was that the kind of behavior and creativity and all of these weird sensory things that were going on for me, and these other worlds that existed, were not welcome if I was going to have a life, and that I needed to put that away in order to be successful in the world. And probably for most of my life, that's the way I've seen it. Like, that needs to be contained and put away and put in a box, and it needs to be medicated, and it needs to be CBT'd, and it needs to be kind of put into a wellness plan. And like, the part of me that will exist in the world will be successful if it is compliant, if it's conformist, if it speaks articulately, if it learns through traditional education or whatever. And being able to do that, being able to separate it, meant that I could be successful in my career, that I could be successful in relationships in certain ways, but that I was dragging this other world with me wherever I went. And that I was always being told that I needed to get rid of it, and that it was silly, or that it was like not required. And the more I left it behind, the more isolated I felt, and the more lonely I was, and the less I felt like a person, or that had feelings and emotions, because they all went to that other place so that I could function in the real world as was seen by other people. And then just how easy it became to swallow that and hide it under medication and hide it under these things. But then how I didn't have any stories to tell in the real world anymore, because all of the things that I'd felt were valuable and meaningful to me, like my granddad being at that Millennium Night, like the fact that I can still remember being able to fly as a child, like it's a memory, it's there. And how all that magic disappeared over time and was like just buried underneath all of this stuff. And how much pain that was held in that, but also how much possibility was held in that, and how I just felt like I was functioning as a cardboard cutout. But to all intents and purposes, to services that I interacted with, the mental health services, I'm pleased now that I didn't get too stuck in that system. I was in and out of there, but they weren't interested in me because I was functioning on the outside. And then what happened when for the first time I was seen and heard, and how that has been, for me, a huge thing that's come out of listening to people's stories over the last couple of days, just that pivotal moment of being seen and heard in a way that opens the possibility for those stories to be told. And then everything that unfolds thereafter. And I've really been curious about this journey from being seen and heard to feeling part of this bigger thing, this community, this national, international, local, global, whatever community that has us rooted together in a sense of social action, and wanting to see change and wanting to see these things be possible, maybe for more people sooner in more places, that this opportunity to be seen and heard and to create this new potential could be what we're all thinking about in terms of this movement towards something different. So this for me was like, right, okay, because I'd said that I want to talk about social network analysis, and I'd said that I want to tell stories and have conversations. And each of these places on this route can in some way or another be linked to a role in a social network in the way that that's understood. And I think the thing for me is that what I'd really like to do is think about what this network analysis offers, like really challenge it, because social network analysis comes from understanding the way networks work for two purposes: one, to create them, and two, to destroy them. So my background is in intelligence analysis, and it was inevitable in that role that my job would be to try to destroy networks. So part of my training was around how to dismantle terrorist networks, how to dismantle organised crime groups. And it was always focused on the negative. And I always felt like that somehow, even though I see the value in that from the point of view of preventing harm or preventing crime, there was something in me that was always disappointed about the fact that we weren't trying to forge connections that prevented that from being necessary in the first place. So I was kind of hoping to be able to like tap into a little bit of the part of me that was really always disappointed by the lack of possibility in that knowledge from before. And also because I've created this morning, like I've done my best to kind of throw together this like kind of scrapbook type of ideas to take us on a journey. So what I want to say is, like, I really don't just want to talk for like the next hour. I would love for people to pop things into the chat, or if you've got a question, like, you're welcome to interrupt us if someone raises a question. I'm going to follow this general kind of flow, but there's no need for me just to talk. But I will just talk and fill the gap if you don't mind. So in this Geordie accent that very few people actually understand outside of the northeast of England. So so please do talk to me about what I'm talking about, and hopefully we can think through some of this stuff, because I don't know whether or not this is helpful or right, or an interest, like a way to be able to see and think about this. Like I'd really be interested to see whether or not there's other people who find it helpful to see things through this particular lens, I guess. So the photographs on this slide are they're from the the Welcome Photography Prize from last year. And I'm kicking myself because I know the guy's name, that's gone out of my head because of the fact that I am now sat in front of a Zoom screen. But I just remember feeling really like something was spoken for us that hadn't been spoken before through these photographs. The collection, or the series rather, from this photographer, and I will find his name and drop it in the chat before the end of this session, is called Prozac, and it's about like just kind of like this, like the confoundment of like mental health stuff. And I really find that those pictures spoke to me in a way that words have really generally not been able to, in terms of that feeling of isolation and separation, the feeling of like being in a place where I really, particularly like that picture in the top left, of being in a place that I really want to be, but being equipped to be in a completely different place, and it just not making any sense that I've landed in that space, that I should have been somewhere else, that I wanted to be somewhere else. And I just love the bottom portal as well, this idea of just being like flattened by stuff. That's how I see it, and other people will see things in different ways, I guess, but just this idea of being flattened by stuff and being like protected almost by the flattening. It's kind of how I see that. And that, so I remember being 14 or 15 years old and being in the school cafeteria. And whatever it was that happened for me happened around about that time, where things felt like they were really ingraining in that separation. And I remember being stood in a room full of people with a tray in my hand with, you know, like comprehensive school cafeteria food on it, which would probably have been like, you know, in the 90s, it'll have been like pizza and baked beans and a slice of flapjack or something. And just being stood in that cafeteria and just not knowing what to do with myself. All of those people that I could have connected with, and I either didn't want or didn't feel able to connect with any of them, and taking myself off to sit on my own, and just like that being a really important and significant memory for me, that sense of just being surrounded by people and not feeling connected to anybody has been something that's kind of floated along in parts of my life, in small groups and in large groups, at work and at home. And all of the ways that I've tried to cope with that, and seeing myself as well as quite separate from networks. And I don't know whether or not it's been part of that being a millennial, which I am by a year, just inside that millennial generation time frame, and having experienced this kind of like childhood where everything was very in person and real and tangible, or felt like that, and then moving through to an adulthood where a lot of stuff feels abstract and online and away from me. And then at the same time, this massive amount of like how much everything is immediate now and it wasn't before. And that a lot of the networks that I feel connected to now, I was first introduced to online by that kind of self-knowledge, going out and trying to understand what was going on for me mentally and emotionally when things weren't working and I was feeling really in a place of real struggle and distress. And that what I saw was what's in that kind of network box, those little notes there, this idea that I was aware that there were people out there who were part of this thing, for example, called like the Human Voices Network, or that were part of this thing called Self-Injury Support, which back then was the Bristol Women's Crisis Service, or that were part of this whatever thing that it was. But that what I saw at that time was this kind of like distant, closed thing that was like these people who were doing their thing and it was theirs and not mine. Being able to read and understand or listen to and understand the concepts that they were talking about, but not really feeling connected to it. Or maybe it's not feeling like it applied to me, or not understanding enough to know that it applied to me, because I was being like force-fed medical model and being force-fed like, you are broken, you are ill, you will never you'll never fit in, you weren't meant to fit in, all that kind of thing was what I felt like I was being, like I needed to be corrected before I could even have access to that. And seeing that as being like a theory that I couldn't reach out into making a reality, those kinds of places where I could get a different kind of help, or where I could find out a different way of being with people. And for me, so taking that back to my understandings of networks and stuff, I saw that as being a closed space that I wasn't part of. And I saw it as being quite a disparate thing that was maybe a handful of people around the world, but not necessarily something I was particularly aware of, or that I knew was as big as it was, or was as close to me as it was, because there are members like within my own community of the Human Voices Network that I would never have guessed was possible. And that what needed to happen for me, and maybe for many of us, was for that to be a human experience, and that I was never going to be able to get access to that until I could let at least one person connect with me. And that happened, but it happened as somebody who is going to be 40 next year, which I'm still coming to terms with. It happened only a few years ago. So from me being 14 to 15 to now, most of that time, I've felt like has been existing in a way that has kept me separate, even with people who I care about, even with people who I have considered to be really close friends, like very barely daring to talk about the stuff that had been silenced when I was younger by a lot of people. And none of it being anything that I fundamentally felt ashamed or afraid of, but that other people did, and that effect on me. So like, and my story, like this is my story, and I get that, and obviously like there's a whole lot of other different experiences out there, but I was quite proud of my difference at first. It wasn't a negative thing, it was turned into something negative by other people, and I think Pete mentioned that earlier as well. I think other people have mentioned it over the last couple of days, that my otherworldliness, my sensory experiences, I was really interested in what they could be, and it was other people who closed them down and taught me that I needed to silence that and be ashamed of it. So even though I felt like I had this really wonderful thing that I could offer, after years and years of not offering it and being disconnected from it, like rediscovering it was quite an amazing thing. And I rediscovered it in one relationship with one person who connected me into this entire different way of thinking. And the fact that there were many, many people in the world who had this entire different way of approaching things that I could never have conceived of on my own, and I could never have conceived of in the place that I grew up and that I came from, if you know what I mean. And that this thing started with the telling of these stories, but started with the question, with me asking about them, and me asking like, so do you see things like this? Or like, and being curious about somebody else, and somebody else trusting me with their experience, even though my frame for my experiences and my frame for what this thing was very much mental illness. Oh, well, that's illness. Oh, well, that's biology. And just patience and trust and time, and that connection and relationship becoming a humanizing experience for me, because then all of a sudden I'm asking questions about myself, and the discovery that something that I'd continuously been told wasn't acceptable might actually find a place where it was accepted and could be something else. And from a from an entry to a network point of view, that's called the bridge. And I love that because it comes up in peer support so often. And I love that idea in peer support. And I keep going back to this so I worked in peer support in the NHS, and then I work in peer support as it part of a youth-led organisation called Peer Hub. And my thing in the NHS was like, peer support needs to be the bridge out. It shouldn't be used to keep people in. It needs to be the bridge out. And trying to explain that bridge out isn't about discharge, that bridge out isn't about retracting support, but that it's introducing people to a community that can wrap around them because they want them to be part of their community rather than services who are obliged. Or that, and I say that tongue in cheek, but I do also appreciate there's an element of truth in that the services are obliged to help, whatever that then looks like on the other side of that. And around these kind of like really significant relationships about liberation and release, and then the discovery of what happens afterwards, and the discovery of humanity and community that is just not possible when you're trapped in service type relationships. So that bridge connection for me was like just the most beautiful and important thing, and was what was able to turn this kind of like very abstract group of people that were over there and this really meaningful way of thinking and being with each other that I'd never even I'd never known had been kind of like conceptualized and agreed upon, if you like, rather than feeling like that there was a right and a wrong, and the right was medical and the wrong was other people who didn't know what they were doing messing about with this stuff. I don't know if anyone else like has been through that kind of like puzzlement of like, hang on a second, what is this thing, and how did somebody else get ownership of this knowledge? Like how was it not medicine? Do you know what I mean? So that was really quite a significant thing for me. And that challenge to me was the hardest part for me to get over, because it required a whole shift in worldview. And it also, for me, at that time in my life where I was at, needed me to come off the medication because I couldn't find my stories while I was on it. And that's my truth. And it took me a long time to come off the medication. I certainly didn't take that lightly, and I did it with a lot of support and with a lot of help from my medical team, and also from my friends and family, and from my most trusted friends, because my God was Vikki unleashed at that point, like just like boom. And it was not what I expected, but that changing worldview was needed for me. The ability to reconnect with myself and everything that came with that, and everything that had been absent for years. And with that also came a whole second round of rejection, and a whole new round of being put back in my box. And because of the fact that I'd spent so long being medicated and being contained, that when that was unleashed, I feel like it felt like an unleashing, when those limits were removed, when I was able to reconnect with myself and reconnect with that world, it was different. And all of the ways that I'd learned to be before, and all of the ways that I'd coped, not many of them great ways, to be fair, but all of those things, like I'd forgotten it. It'd been years. It'd been absolutely years since I'd had to deal with myself as who I truly was. And it took trust and time and commitment to me, and my commitment to other people, my ability to eat humble pie and ask for forgiveness for times where I'd said or done things that I felt terrible about, but the fact that was possible to repair, and that I was trusted, and that I could see in somebody else who had similar experiences that actually there's a future, and that it doesn't end here, and it doesn't end with me, but that there's a community that I can be a part of. it meant something to me that I could understand what that community was. And for me, that meant being able to reconnect with myself and with those experiences that had been buried for so long. But just that kind of like being able to, so the word mirror on there is that kind of like being able to see myself in other people and being able to love that part of myself in other people and seeing the hope for myself in other people. And that sense of maybe there's something in here, this that's worth something, giving me courage to step forward into that new world. And the reason why, so this is a terrible drawing, because I did have all of 2 minutes to do it this morning in my defense. But this idea of this there being this mental patient, which is me, on one side of the bridge, and someone prepared to show me what was on the other side, that I just didn't know what it was, but being able to trust and take the courage that that was something that could mean something to me, that was such a significant experience for my life, that I wanted to take that risk and step into it. But without that relationship, without that single person who allowed me to be that person with them, you know, who allowed me to be myself with them, it would never, ever have happened. And sometimes, and it just takes to take a note of the fact that these communities are different to the communities that I was used to being in. Like, in the communities that I was used to being in, I was in policing, I was in health service, I worked in the legal sector for a long time. Like, these are hierarchical institutions where the most important person is at the top. But in this situation, the most important person for me, there is, like, I'm not saying there's a top or a bottom. Like, we know that status shifts and moves around, like, that's human, that's fine, but there isn't a top and a bottom in this that I can see. The most important person in the whole of the thing was the person who I first connected with in a way that allowed me to do that. And that person, in terms of like whether it's the Human Voices Network or whether it's intentional peer support or psychiatric survivor movement or human rights movements or Black Lives Matter or whatever it was that touched me, that meant something to me, that was a new network or a new community that I stepped into, the most important person was that first person who made that relationship with me. And that for me was like, just like turned everything on its head and completely shifted my understanding of what an important relationship was, or what I might want to strive to do with my life, that I might not see the value in climbing hierarchy anymore, but that I might see a value in a different way of being. And that was my introduction into these kinds of communities. So what time are we on? I'm going to stop for a second because I feel like I've been talking for ages. I'm just going to briefly stop my share. Kelly, can I just check in with you? Is that all right? Are you all right with what's going on in the chat? Because I can't read and talk at the same time.
That's okay. There's been some beautiful interactions happening within the chat, people that have really resonated with what you're sharing. I think David has been really, really generous in sharing things that have been helpful for himself in regards to networks. I think that Andrew Hart, like, to me, it really resonated when he just wrote peer support is the bridge out. Like, yes, Vikki, like, I think that was a really lovely comment that just came through earlier. And Ben Cooley Hall, he has made a really interesting comment on mental health professionals generally lack humility and curiosity in relation to people they are trying to support or treat, because they are taught a body of knowledge and taught that it is all that they need to know, and this primes us to be uninterested in the wisdom and expertise of people with lived experience. I think that was beautifully said.
I think there is, and do you know what I love about these kinds of conversations around lived experience and stuff, is that it really so I feel like I could go down a rabbit hole with this. I'm going to try and keep like somewhere near the surface. Like, it really highlights to me about this just huge discomfort in uncertainty, and how in professional structures, when they can be certain about something or they can bank on it for more than 50% of the time that that's going to work, that to them that becomes a really important and significant, and I'm generalizing, I appreciate that, but it can become a really important and significant thing. And we've seen that with medication. I think that medication has its uses, and I agree with Peter that it does, when Peter was talking earlier about that, it has its uses, but it's over relied on as a sense of certainty that this will work if only we get it right. And that actually that what I love about Hearing Voices Network, what I love about intentional peer support and other similar kinds of like ways of making sense of relationships and things and our experiences, is that there is a lot of space for uncertainty, and there's a lot of space for the discomfort of being uncertain, and the sharing of that, and being able to hold that discomfort together and not try and contain it and not run away from it and not see it as risky, but actually that discomfort is actually really, really human. And I love that. And that, I think that if there was one lesson, there's many lessons that I think that could be shared from our community to our communities to services, but that would be the one that I would want them to take, that it's all right, not like that actually that there's value in not knowing, and that we don't need to jump to answers, and that the answers actually more often than not cause more harm in that system than solve any problems, whatever those. I don't know where I learned this bunny ear thing from, but like just that kind of like,
that's we get it. That's
but I feel like I've
become part of the language.
Yeah, like what? But that kind of like putting us in a box of problem to solve is that discomfort with uncertainty, isn't it? I think.
I think that that's a really valuable and beautiful point, and just that ability to be able to sit with uncomfortability or the unknown and not having to fix it, just
and
making space for it.
Absolutely. And I learned that I'm not very good at it, if I'm honest. I find it really hard, but I learned that from intentional peer support. That was an eye-opener for me. Like, what? Like, we don't know what? Like, that's not what I was told. And how comfortable I am in knowing and not knowing.
So maybe this is a nice spot where we could open up and see if anybody had any comments or questions for you, and just if you want to give us a wave or raise your hand or write a comment in. Check the chat. Thank you to David for sharing so much of your personal journey within the chat.
It's in that chat now. Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you. And that thing about just how far we have to travel to get to this, I think, David, I think I share that kind of like how far away it was, how far the journey felt to get from where I was to where I am now in years, but also in learning and effort. It was at times exhausting, and then at other times absolutely inspiring and energizing, I guess. But has anyone got anything that they want to chip in, or should I dive back into?
I think everyone's keen to keep hearing from you.
Oh, well, I can't say. So one of the ways that I decided that I was going to deal with this stuff was to become a performer, which means that I quite like the sound of my own voice. I do have to make intentional kind of spaces for her. Like, once I get on that role, that's what these things, like, it wasn't intentional, but yeah. Music's made a huge difference to me over time. And another one of these kind of networks where I've had the chance to meet a lot of weird and wonderful people, I guess. So yeah, so bridges, moving towards them.
Sorry, just David has just written that he's interested in practical methods to create connections that we find fulfilling.
Yeah, fab. Hopefully I'll be able to, but I'm gonna can we come back to that, Kelly? And hopefully I'll find a route to it through here. Yeah. Right, okay, hang on. So looking from the outside in, I guess, and having been quite like learning how to do isolation quite well and learning how to do separate quite well, I think that I assumed pretty much that like that front facing person, if I think of like there being like a front facing me that saw that the world saw, and then the me that I kept hidden, that front facing person was what everybody else was doing, what everybody else was like. Because of the fact that my kind of like internal self had been dismissed and rejected, like, oh, well, that's unusual to have that in. So when I looked on whether it was the Human Voices Network, or whether it was IPS, Intentional Peer Support, or human rights movements, psychiatric survivors, I think I pretty much just assumed that like everybody else was like their public facing self and the limitations of what a public facing self can actually be. So, you know, like you get a sound bite. The number of times that I'd seen kind of like really interesting and meaningful clips of quotes or phrases and just being like, okay, so that's who that is. But actually that isn't who that is, but that we are very like rich, complex, like well, we all have different ideas, but I kind of think of people as being like this kind of like infinite soul, not like just not containable within a human body or within an identity that I can perceive. And that actually that this looking onto these networks and these groups and these communities of whoever they are is always going to be misleading. And I felt that my isolation hugely affected my perception of what those networks were and what was important to them. But that once I had been introduced to a bridge like through that bridge to other members of the network, I realized that I've been quite naive in that perception, and that this idea of there being a closed network made up of a select number of people that may or may not be international or may be local, that actually there's all of these different relationships happening, all of which have different characteristics, and all of those humans in this very kind of messy spiderwebby network of the community network. And this concept of betweenness is something that I have found fascinating. So it's kind of betweenness is kind of like the 6 degrees of separation, or the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, was it, that came out after that? That was like kind of how many steps are there between. But in network analysis, it's about how many routes are there through and what are the different natures of those routes, which basically means kind of like, if I'm, so just sorry, Ken, we're just going to pick on you for a second, but if I'm connected to Kelly, and Kelly's connected to someone else, is connected to someone else, is connected to someone else, is connected to Jackie, for example, how many routes are there between me and Jackie? And how many routes are there through me for Kelly to walk down? Does that make sense? So, and that in networks like, I would examine like organised crime groups and terrorist cells and things like that. There would be an edge, and that edge would normally be a closed edge. So if you weren't inside the network, you had no relationship with the network. But the Human Voices thing doesn't seem to have an edge because there's a route through and back most of the time. And that it's the same in IPS. So there'll be routes that I would take through my connections to people. And there would be routes that they would take through their connections to me that would lead back to each other. So it's kind of cyclical. It's like, I don't know if I'm doing a good job of explaining this. The point being that it can become quite overwhelming at a point when you enter into a network, that it's huge and that it's like there's all these people, many of whom you don't know, Many of whom are invisible to you in terms of like, this sits beyond someone, but there is still someone between them and you. But for me, I found it really reassuring because of the fact that all of a sudden I felt like there was a possibility that wherever I went in the world, there could be someone who could accept me, and there could be someone who I could have a relationship with, even if I'd never seen them, even if I didn't know their name, that there was probably someone in, I don't know, like, there's probably someone in the town over. So I live in a little village called Chastity Street, I live in a village called Great Lumley that's in Chastity Street. It's not that great, but I do live in a village called Great Lumley, and our local town is Chastity Street. There's probably someone in Chastity Street who's a member of the Human Voices Network as well, or a member of IPS, is always interested in this stuff. But equally that there's someone on the south coast of South America, or, you know, meeting some of the contacts that I made through intentional peer support, that there are people in New Zealand and Australia, and then introduce them to other networks and things like that. But all of a sudden there's like this kind of worldwide presence and potential, and places don't feel separate and places don't feel scary as much. But that when you first enter a network, because of that betweenness, what you have is your influencers, which means something different in network analysis to what it does on Instagram. And I'll talk about that in a second. Although it's stolen from network analysis, the influencer thing on Instagram. So what you have is influencers, and what you have, and then this kind of like mass of anonymous people that you share some kind of connection with. It's weird. I'm saying you, but I mean I guess. And for me, there was a process of having to make sense of what this big community was, to find a way to navigate it, and to find a way for that possibility of there being someone on the other side of the world who would welcome me into their community, to turn that from an idea to something that was tangible. Oh. But for me, that teenager on the bottom left, that's me, by the way, with me sweater shop jumper on from 1996. Woo! Yeah, that's me as a teenager. And just thinking about how much I'd learned from being that age to, at the time where I'd entered, like, you know, learned about intentional peer support, met some people from the psychiatric survivor movement, started to make connections through HVN and stuff like that, and this different way of thinking and thinking about the world. And that what I'd learned is that I didn't have the words to talk about it. So that picture on the top left hand side is another picture from last year's Welcome Prize around mental health, and it was where the photographer took a portrait of young people, and then asked them to draw on their picture, and that obviously that young lady, that was what she drew. And thinking back again what Peter was talking about earlier on about the assumption of what that would mean, because to me that silencing was the silencing of the world that I had created, or the way that I wanted to be in the world, that got silenced and pushed into another reality for me, which, can I just say, is quite a nice place, and I spent a lot of time there still, but that the fact that it was silenced meant that I didn't have the language to describe it as I was entering into these new relationships. And for me, that was huge. Like, I felt completely stuck, even as I was entering a place where I knew that there was going to be a real intention to welcome me and to listen and hear and see through that bridge of a person into new connections in the network. I felt completely inept in being able to communicate in that space. I didn't understand the concepts. It took me a long time to unlearn what I believed to be scientific truth about who I was and what was wrong with me. And that was a loss, because that was a certainty, like we just said, I guess. And even though I feel I'm in a much better place now, it was a loss. Like that not being mentally ill was a loss. I could blame a lot of not very nice behaviour or mistakes or relationship breakdowns on mental illness. It wasn't my fault. It was quite an easy bucket to put stuff into when things went wrong. And now I have had to, well, I haven't had to, but now I guess personal accountability and integrity have a different meaning to me now. It's what my role is in that. But I had to learn that, and it was hard. And this kind of feeling of being on the sense of being just on the outside of a place where I could find belonging, which I'd never had before, which made me both, on the one hand, extremely excited and keen to meet all of these people, and on the other hand, absolutely terrified of rejection, which is hard. Not necessarily, so I'm going to correct that, not necessarily being frightened of rejection, being frightened of being wrong about this being a place, being frightened of it being a red herring or something that I'd imagined. That a network of people who would be open and accepted and interested in my story was a red herring and something that I'd invented for myself because I wanted it rather than it was real. So I felt like in this very precarious position. And what allowed me to step into that was lots of people sharing stories, like in personal relationships, in these new relationships that I was forming through that person who was my bridge, that they would introduce me to people who shared their stories with me in peer support groups, in hearing and reading people's stories and presentations and public speaking. That opened up the possibilities for things that I could talk about, and listening and attuning myself to this new language and learning the words that I'd learned to describe myself that were now not necessarily unacceptable, but harmful, and recognize and having a kind of like do that very strange shift of self from the words that I'd been using to describe myself and recognizing that they were harmful to me through listening to other people's experiences of the harm. And these realizations, and I remember going through about 2 years of just feeling like I was falling off a cliff every time someone spoke about their experience, not because it wasn't incredibly valuable to me to hear, but because of the fact that there were just rugs being pulled out from under me, words that were being taken away and replaced with something that was better and that was more real and a better describer of my experience, but that I had to fall down, like I had to have something pulled out from under as far as to be able to take the next thing on. And it was hard and it was beautiful. Like it's just like, it was excruciating and beautiful, and just like over and over and over again with every new person I met and with every experience that I heard, that the loss and the feeling and being able to feel it felt like such a privilege and a gift and such a generosity, and yet like required an amount of time and reflection and recovery for me to be able to take that into my sense of self and learn and grow from it and appreciate that actually that had been true all along, and that what I'd attached to was a much more harmful way of looking at myself, but it was easier and it was available and it made sense. So that kind of like harmful way of attaching to myself being those words that we hear all the time around kind of illness and biology and those kinds of curbs on behavior and containment around being manipulative, being an attention seeker, all those kinds of things, that by pulling that rug out from under us, that was like, actually, you're not having that anymore, that's not the way to describe that, and replacing it with something else, was a journey that I really wanted to go on, but it was painful to go on. I was giving something up in order to get back something that was much more rich and much more me and much more helpful. I don't know, but like, there's probably a list of words, and I feel like words are something that's always been absent for me. But every new story, every new experience, whether I could personally relate or not, took me on that journey for a while, and still does, actually, to a certain extent. And I love it. I bloody love it. There's times when I just crave it. I just want, and obviously, like, for me, I appreciate that's intrusive, but I just want to hear other people's stories. I want to hear that other people are going through what I'm going through. Even like today, like, I feel like it's such an important part of belonging to a community, is that the sharing and the giving of experience to each other, with those, you know, limits on permission, and it being someone's story to share rather than someone's story to take. But how much of a difference that's made. That line across the bottom of the page, I do not think that she would be served in any way by becoming a psychiatric patient, was written about me on my notes, because I got my notes, which sometimes I wish I didn't, but I did get them. Was written about me when I was 15 years old, and I never knew it was on my file, and no one ever said that to me. And I wish that I could go back and sit down with a psychiatrist who wrote that and ask him what he meant, because I feel like if I'd had that chance to sit down in front of that guy and understand, I might have taken a very different journey in my life. Because the way I read that now, I do not think she would be served in any way by becoming a psychiatric patient. What I hear now is all of the stuff that I learned by being a psychiatric patient, I wouldn't have learned, and I would have gotten to this place sooner. Who knows whether that would be true, but I would have loved to meet the man now who wrote that note on my file and found out what he meant. Because I think he was right. I think he was right, and I think I wouldn't have believed him at the time. So this idea of kind of a network opening through storytelling, I guess. So in a network, an influencer is a person with centrality. What does that mean then? It means someone who is surrounded by people and who has an equal amount of betweenness to each side of the network. So that means basically that they are in the middle, that the network builds around them. And so an influencer, they would be seen as an influencer from a social network analysis perspective, particularly in terms of criminal activity, because the assumption would be that they can communicate with and therefore influence a large proportion of the network directly or with the smallest number of in-between connections. But I don't think that that's what an influencer, what those roles, so they're called influencers or figureheads, but I think probably within the psychiatric survivor movement, within the MAD movement, certainly within IPS, intentional peer support, probably I'm guessing also within human voices, networks and groups and spaces and these kinds of places, human rights movements, that kind of thing, that these people rise from within, that they may draw people to them, but that's not how they became influencers central in the first place, but that there's something that they're saying, there's something that they're talking about, that is a shared knowledge, a shared experience that makes sense, that people gather around, and that people pay attention to. And that's how we get to know who they are, and that's how the message gets shared, and that's how the network is punctuated. So, for example, the Wildflower Alliance in Western Mass is thousands of miles from me, but I know who they are. And I know who they are because they've got a presence, because they're talking about things that I'm interested in, because they're part of the IPS network, and we also do Human Voices stuff, because they're social action. And I know who some people are in that network. I've never met them, but I value what they've got to say, and I want to listen to what they've got to say. And that's what I mean by an influencer. But that is born of people talking about them and telling me about them, and not necessarily about me going looking for them. And for this kind of sense of respect of what they do, that's kind of moved outwards through my connections. And so, like, that might be something that I think of as being an influencer or a figurehead. And that there's elements of that, and kind of like network nodes in different countries, in different places around the world, and also my local community and here in the UK. But that it's like a kind of a uniting anchor. Like, this is what we're interested in, this is what we're trying to do, and this is where you can find it in the States, this is where you can find it in New Zealand, this is where you can find it in Ireland, or in Europe, or in, I've made some fantastic connections in other parts of the world as well. And just those kind of the value of those points where you can say, and that is somewhere where they also share this approach. But then the value of the in-between conversations, of the connections between people that make it kind of human, and that make it about people, and not just about ideas, and not just about concepts, but about human beings and their stories, and why it is that this approach might be working, or why it is that this approach might be worth my effort and time, or worth somebody else's effort and time, or why I might want to talk about it. And when someone comes to me and says that they're struggling, why I might want to connect them in to this network. And that kind of like always bringing it back to the humanity, and always bringing it back to people and experience and stories and sharing and collectiveness, whilst not losing the self in all of that, I guess. So then for me, the influencer then becomes instead the anchor, that we can move around, that we can talk about this piece of work, that particular person's keynote at the Congress, or a particular podcast or whatever, that this then becomes the in-betweenness. These conversations can enable the in-betweenness that's anchored around these real people in different places in the world that feel connected, that I feel connected to, even though I've never met them, and who I know are connected to other people whose names I don't know, whose faces I'll probably never see, but that I feel connected to. And that makes me feel better about being in the world, if I'm honest. Like, it makes me feel like this place is a place that I can belong. And I've still got the other places that I can go to, but it doesn't feel separate anymore. It doesn't feel like it's a secret, or it's forbidden, or it's wrong, or it's broken, or it needs to be contained. It just feels like something else that's with me, because of the fact that in these spaces and with these people who I can hear speaking all over the world, like, there's a possibility that they experience something similar, or there's a possibility that that we can find a shared language to talk about this stuff. And I'm almost convinced of the fact that my story will be welcome there, and that it wouldn't be silenced. And that means, from a place of feeling completely isolated to a place of feeling like I've got connections on the other side of the planet with people I've never met yet, like, that's quite a change, it's quite a shift. And it means something really, really deep and important to me. So, and that, I guess, would be like skipping on what I was trying to say, that for me, I've been taken to places either physically, or sometimes now these days, like, through Zoom, like through music and through peer support and through, developing relationships with people with lived experience and activism. And I've been taken all these places and felt welcome there. And and then also so the little me there that's at the kind of top left of that doodle, I guess, sketch note, that those arrows pointing out in the opposite direction are the acknowledgement of the fact that there are other people around me who don't share this and who I don't feel that way about. But what happened to me, which I just still can't get over, it just baffles me, is that all of a sudden I don't need to hide the things that I felt have been silenced and separated before. My internal self, I can bring that with me, that I can bring that part of me to my relationships. I might not have to speak to it. I might not acknowledge it or talk about it in places where I don't feel safe, but that doesn't mean that I can't bring it and it's not there. It's not hidden away. It's not buried under grams and grams of antipsychotics or whatever. But it's present and it's with me. It might not be valued by the other person in that relationship, but it's still valued by me. And I'm still going to bring it. And it's still going to give me something in that relationship. So even though there's this whole network around the world where I feel like I could bring my whole self, those little places where that still isn't welcome doesn't mean that I'm absent from them anymore. It just means that I might be a bit more savvy about what I talk about in those places and a little more quiet about some of the memories that I have that I know, or some of the experiences and feelings that I have that I know aren't going to sit well in those places. But just the fact that I can take it now, I feel like is that I don't feel that void between the two, but I feel like my front-facing self and my internal self have been allowed to come together somewhat. Feels really like a big change over and probably not for a very long period of time, to be fair, probably within the last 12 months, that I've really felt that those can even touch each other now. So yeah. So that's me. So I feel like I've been surprised my entire life, whilst also not having ever really been surprised. But that's one of my favourite pictures of myself, and that's why it's there. I think it must have been my birthday or something. I look like I'm in my birthday kind of garb. I imagine I'd probably just laid eyes on a very large present. Maybe it was a bike, but anyway. So I wanted to kind of finish off with the social action stuff and just talking about this kind of sense of moving from I to we, but not losing the I. And I think that's really critical, because often in doing this work over the last few years, I've felt that, and I've talked about this with other people who do lived experience work, I've almost felt like that I am it's almost permissive for me to be the sacrifice that furthers other people's experience and connection. I'm trying to curb that. I'm trying to curb abandoning the I and the me for the we and the us. Partly because of the fact that I think it hurts us. I think it's harmful for me to do that, and partly because of the fact I don't think that that's what the we and the us really want me to do. But I think it's easy. I don't know whether it's what I've learned over all of those years, and how easy it is for me to feel like I can separate the important stuff from the unimportant stuff and allow the unimportant stuff to be crushed in the process of activism or whatever. But I really think it's important, or it's important to me, to remember that even when we're in the we. But I like this kind of, I feel like I'm probably stolen this cycle from Sherry Mead, and I imagine that if there's anyone in the room who's done IPS training, that it probably feels familiar, but I feel like I'm trying to add on this idea of where social action takes us and how it builds our sense of who the we are. So there's this sense of it kind of like starting with I connect with you, who from that bridge would be like a single person. Like I connect with you, And then through your stories, probably more likely than mine, for me, through your stories, I recognize your humanity. And by your vulnerability in those stories, I recognize my humanity, and that there's things that, because there's things that we share, and that my empathy for you then creates an empathy for us, that we are worthy of better because you're worthy of better than, and in terms of better relationships, better treatment, better, I don't know what better, whatever better is, whatever better is the change, that's the social change that we're trying to create, that we are worthy of this change. And that through evolving, so I think a lot of my stories evolve through people, rather than like I learn more about them and I learn different kinds of meaning, and I get to kind of like have different ideas and senses of things, but that through evolving and sharing experiences and languages, we can create a sense of things that are worthy of action, that are worthy of us doing together. And that my passion for our connection then creates a place in a shared movement. But that I am both changed and unchanged, and so therefore I can come back and question myself, and then I can start again with connecting with you or reconnecting with you. But that you becomes more plural and becomes greater as kind of a walk in closer and further into the network and further into the community. That you isn't my bridge anymore. It's us, it's our collectiveness, it's our kind of our communities and our groups and our relationships. And so I feel like the more people who are in that I connect with you, the more I can recognize humanity, the more I can recognize my own humanity, the more I feel worthy of fighting for something that will change our world. And the more that when I question myself, I feel it's easier to come forward and ask for connection and ask about humanity and experiences and stories. And I think that is kind of like, so I think about in terms of connections, that we're talking about finding a bridge, being able to see those influences and figureheads and the in-betweenness and the humanity that exists within the network. And being able to hear all of those stories. No, it's not all those stories, maybe that's overwhelming, but being able to hear stories and experiences and be exposed to new things and new truths and explore different ways of thinking about the world, but intrinsically in a human way between us. And as the we grows, then the potential for humanity grows, I think, within these spaces. And I am always going to be surprised and wowed by that, just like I was when I saw that bike when I was in that photo. But yeah, so finally, to sum up, because I think there's some intention. I think we can have some intentionality around connections in the spaces that we create and our roles in those spaces, and really kind of like valuing those of us who can be bridges for people and those of us who can be influencers or figureheads. And certainly I think we run away from that a little bit. Certainly I have kind of like from time to time felt really intimidated by the idea of standing and speaking. This kind of idea of imposter syndrome, or this idea of kind of like taking somebody else's voice and taking somebody else's spot, or that my story isn't the one that should be heard in this place or whatever. Like actually having different stories and having different people step into those walls. We can move, we can be fluid, but that it's important for people to be able to say, and there's an anchor over there. And maybe we should value, I don't know. Anyway, I think it's difficult. It's a difficult one when that's interwoven with power and status in a world where power and status has done a lot of harm to a lot of people. The possibilities that come from our vulnerability, from the people in between who don't get seen but who are invaluable, those anonymous people on the other side of the world who I can't see but now I can't imagine a life without. That there's something that happens when that network opens and becomes understandable, that for me was really meaningful. and being able to like organically move between and nurture and to step into different roles and try them and step out, and to be able to share trust and build trust and repair things if when mistakes are made. Like I love that about being able to, the value in a relationship and the value in trust is in repairing when things go wrong rather than getting it right all the time. One of my favorite things of learning from being in relationships, I've really trusted people. Being able to repair is probably the most important and human thing that I'm able to do, because I'm always going to make mistakes, and I make many of them all the time, and I'm very good at making mistakes, and so therefore I need to be very good at finding a human way to repair them, I think. And then so how that creates a sense of belonging that can expand like beyond our immediate relationships. And I think in mental health there's an awful lot of focus on our immediate relationships, even in good stuff, you know, like trauma-informed stuff, in peer support groups. There's a lot of focus on belonging and sense of the like those relationships that sit in front of us. But what about those relationships that sit behind? I think they are important. Maybe it's not as immediately important all of the time, but I do think they're important. And then just like our stories and what they're able to create and how important they are, like how incredibly important they are, whether they're told or not, but especially if they're told, in terms of what they can mean to a community and how much we value them and how much we honour them. And in whichever community we're part of, and there's many, isn't there? So like, you know, it can sometimes feel like a big mush, but there's kind of like intersecting communities all around this with these kinds of approaches that's similar to the Human Voices movement, but that how valuable our stories are across these communities in ways that they aren't always outside them, and how important it is to protect that, I think, personally. So yeah. So in terms of like nurturing those relationships, I think, and those connections, I think there's just a real kind of like sense of intentionality and awareness of the fact that we're welcoming someone to our way of thinking and their way of thinking. I think the intentional peer support relational kind of framework, the tasks of and principles of intentional peer support are really helpful with that, in terms of intentionally building relationships with a purpose of thinking about our worldviews together, thinking about our stories, connecting to each other. I find that an incredibly helpful way of thinking about things. And I think I dropped briefly into Lisa Archibald's concurrent session earlier on today where she was talking about that. I just think it's a really fantastic way of thinking about relationships, and really has helped me think about the fact that before I get down to the nitty gritty of trying to kind of like be in a trusting relationship with someone and like hold mutuality and be a friend or be a peer or be whatever, first I need to find a connection that's meaningful, and then I need to be aware of my worldview and what I'm bringing, and be open to theirs. Like that for me was really helpful to learn, and to just give me the chance to take my time with relationships and give me the chance to kind of really see the value of everybody who's in a relationship, and to think about connection in a way that was more intentional rather than it happens or it doesn't happen, and if it doesn't happen it's not going to. So right, I'm rambling now, I'm going to stop because I'm rambling. Yada yada yada.
No, Vikki, thank you so much. I know within the last few slides that you kind of elicited some really deep comments. I just wanted to quickly reflect a couple of those back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew kind of cited you as that permissive to sacrifice for the sake of others. Just what an awareness it is to have drawn attention to that. And he commented that he knows others that experience that in peer work. And I know that that was a point that really resonated for me, but I just, it was really well put in the chat.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you guys. But yeah, I think there was a point where I realized that, where I was just like, I was sorting somebody else before I sorted myself.
And Ben has just commented about that during this presentation, the way of showing up with so much authenticity has invited him to show up in himself with a similar authenticity. Even if I'm not talking to you and others out loud, it's heart-touching way of engaging, so beautiful. In other words, I think you've embodied, modeled what you articulate in one of your earlier slides so beautifully. So I think that that's a really beautiful reflection for you. And I know that I felt and thought that throughout the presentation. So
thank you.
You've just shared yourself so wonderfully. And I think those comments that you had around power and figureheads, and I know that the board of Intervoice is really aware of that, and that there's been immense conversations over the last 7 years that, or longer, that I've been involved. And yeah, I feel like we're really at a place now to move away from those barriers or ideas that have been put around us, and to realize that we're just a conduit to share all the wonderful work that's being done by each and every individual within the movement.
Yeah, and I think though that there's been a need for those conversations, and I've needed to hear them, to be honest, because I came from a place where power was so, like working police, and like your power's on your shoulders, that whatever your number is or whatever the symbol is on your shoulder dictates how much power that you have in a room. And that still, if I was working in policing, I would still be referring to people as sir or ma'am, or for the people who I knew the names of, boss or chief. Like that would be how I would refer to people, and it was such a comfortable way to be because it was so open and overt. And then having to face the reality of the Black Lives Matter movement and of a lot of the social movements that says, actually what you guys are doing is really harmful. In fact, it's killing people. Like Jesus, like those conversations need to be had. They need to be had in places all over the world, and especially in systems. But being able to pay attention to it, and then being able to, I think, being able to understand that the context of that power is different in different communities and different places, and being able to recognize when it shifts out of that. I think that's a really something that I had to spend a lot of time learning through peer support, about watching that power shift and watching it in myself, whereas someone who is quite comfortable being in power hierarchies, because that's how I was raised and socialized at work, that I can just take that, like, because I feel comfortable with power because I've learned to live with it, and that actually really traumatizes people, and I can't do that. Even if I trust myself with it, they might not, and that's where the trauma is. So I think it's really important to have those conversations and to be really open with it. Like really, I do. And I'm pleased, and I was pleased to be part of similar kinds of conversations in different communities. So
I'm just aware that we've only got a minute, but does anybody have a comment or that they would like to share with Vikki?
Vikki, it's Andrew. I just really liked the way that it was quite, you just used your knowledge around social networks, your way you illustrated it as well as spoke to it was just it's just opened my heart and mind, and I liked how you kind of pulled apart the power and really gave us another way of understanding how we can be with people. It really meant a lot to me, that idea of bridge, and I felt like I need those bridges, and I'm going to start looking for them in my own life, but also how I might be a bridge for others. So that's something that that's just one thing out of many things that you shared. So I just want to say thank you so much for sharing, and giving of yourself in the way that you have today. So
thank you. And it feels good to hear. Thank you, Andrew, and I'm really grateful for that. So thank you. And I'm like, I love these spaces because it's so permissive to bring those emotions and those feelings. That's what I love about places like this, and that's why I think Ray just mentioned there about, for me, it doesn't matter whether these kinds of things happen in person or online, but what I've really missed about being in person is being able to set the time aside to be in these spaces, because I'm at home and I work from home, thank you very much, COVID. And like just trying to create like an hour to sit and listen to somebody speak while the phone's going, while the emails are pinging. Like I would have loved to have been able to come to Ireland and just block this time out of the diary and be somewhere else and be entirely in this space. So it's been wonderful to hear this from, you know, all the different parts of the world where it's been over the last couple of days. But I really wish I'd been able to just like dedicate the full 3 days to this, because I've had to take so much from it. So thank you.
Can I just say a quick thing? I didn't want you to have, even though we made some written comments, I didn't want it to be silenced, but I thought of a specific other thing I can add in addition to my thank you for your, you know, your way of being here. But even your slides, they're in this like, you know, technological slideshow, but they've got this humanized element of this handwritten, sketched, organic, and that was like really helpful to me. And I think that, I don't get too like philosophical, but that I think that speaks to power too. It's like taking like, you know, this kind of knowledge that we might write out with our own hands is just as valid as whatever might seem more printed or whatever. So as someone who like puts together all kinds of presentations, it was like very helpful for me to see that. So among many other things, thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Ben, because it's the first time I've done it. I was in a panic this morning and I was like, shite, sorry, I'm just gonna have to write it and take photos because I haven't got time to figure it out on PowerPoint. So thank you so much for that, because I think I kind of half, when I saw it on the side, I was like, actually, I like this. I might do this again. Thank you so much for that.